Pope Francis made a historic visit to the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan to spread the message of peace. During his visit to DRC, he urged the people not to give in to divisions and condemned the inhumane violence in the east, where many armed groups have been causing unrest for decades. In Kinshasa, he held a mass that was attended by over 1 million people. And in South Sudan, he promoted forgiveness, reconciliation and peace. This was a significant trip, as it marked the first time in Christian history the leaders of the Catholic, Anglican and Reformed traditions conducted a joint foreign visit. Now let's examine the importance and expectations of the Pope's visit to these countries in this package.
Nearly 8 years since the Pope's first papal visit to Africa, he has visited Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan. The Pope's visit has come at a time when these countries are facing some of their worst security challenges. Known for the peace he and his position represent, Pope Francis' visit is expected to impact not just the African Catholic setting, but security on the continent. The extent to which this is achieved is yet to be understood and needs further analysis. Africa is a significant continent in the world and one which has some of the most religious people on earth. Visits like the Pope's are important and may be the right platform for peace talks and youth encouragement. In a continent which has some of the greatest blessings of the world, how to make this count has become a major topic for discourse. What can Africa gain from the Pope's visit? Will the terrorists and rebel groups choose the way of the Lord? Time will tell.
Now joining me on Secure the Continent for analysis on this and more, I have Professor Stanchu Ilo, Research Professor of Catholic and African Studies at DePaul University. He joins us from Illinois, Chicago. And I also have Daniel Van Dalen, a Senior Analyst at Signal Risk. He joins in from Cape Town, South Africa. Well, welcome to you, gentlemen, and thanks for joining me on the program.
Thank you.
Now, I'd like to start with Professor Ilo. It was the first time since 1983 that a Pope will visit the Democratic Republic of Congo. It is the country with the largest number of Catholics in Africa. What was the focus, the primary focus of Pope Francis's visit to the DRC and South Sudan? And what message was he hoping to convey to the people in these countries?
Thank you very much, Gbenga, for having me this very interesting program. Pope Francis primarily came as a messenger of peace to both the DRC and South Sudan. So I think his goal was also to focus the attention of the world on the longest war going on in Africa and indeed in the world, in the DRC. This is a country that has been at war for over 50 decades. More than 6 million people have been killed during these wars in the Congo. Then you have more than 3 million internally displaced people in the Congo. So we're talking about today in global politics, the focus has been on Ukraine. And I think any place that human beings, human lives are being destroyed, we all should be concerned. So it's not just about Africa and the rest, but then Congo is forgotten and the exploitation in Congo has been there, the destruction has been there since the time of slavery. So I think he wanted to draw attention to this devastation, this human hemorrhage taking place in the Congo that is often forgotten. And I mean, Europeans are fighting to protect Ukraine, but European forces, Belgium, and many other countries in Europe are primarily responsible for the carnage that has visited this country, Congo. The same with South Sudan. The Pope is also wanted to draw attention to the war, the suffering, the inhumanities, and the victims of this war. So basically, I think he came not really to be a miracle worker. I mean, you can't solve this convoluted and complex problem through 1 day or 2 days visit. it will require a political solution. I mean, moral suasions and religious appeals can touch the heart, but I think that basically the heavy lifting has to be done now that the Pope is gone.
Thank you, Professor Ola. I'd like to bring in Daniel van Dalen from Cape Town, South Africa. Now, the Pope, during his visit to the DRC, did interact and he met victims of conflict and human rights abuses. And as Professor Ila highlighted, the conflict in Congo has been going on for decades with lots of human rights abuses and victims and deaths and displacement caused. Now, how has the conflict in eastern DRC affected civilians, and what efforts have been made before the Pope's visit to, respond to this long suffering and the violence that is happening there? I do understand that United Nations biggest mission, peacekeeping force, MONUSCO, has been there for over 20 years, and they haven't been able to solve the problem of violence in the eastern DRC. What is the root cause of this violence, and what has been done to protect the innocent people in these regions?
So I think the root cause of the violence in the Congo is multifaceted, and as the other guest said, it fundamentally stems from way back the exploitation that has happened over the decades in that country, and unfortunately under Kabila, the corruption didn't necessarily stop, and you have a part of the country that is so mineral rich, and obviously after the Congo wars, we had instability in that region that never quite recovered. And obviously the emergence of these armed groups don't help in terms of stabilization. So obviously you can't necessarily say all the armed groups are there for the same reason. You have ones that are, you get the My groups, for example, that are self-defense militias that fundamentally, become these armed rebel outfits, and they control minerals, and, they, attack communities for access over the artisanal mining rights. You have ethnic-based militias that, that will kill and ransack localities for the sake of, their belief of they view the other, and that's obviously, to them, it's a hostile entity. You also get the entities such as the ADF. From an ideological perspective, obviously they've pledged their allegiance to the Islamic State. And obviously you have, all of those, each province has its different severity of insecurity. But North Kivu, obviously we've seen now, specifically with M23, the ADF has probably been the most effective. Just in terms of if we go to MONUSCO, unfortunately, MONUSCO does not have an offensive mandate. So their mandate from the get-go has been a facilitation force, protection of civilians. So, over the years, it's been a case of they'll protect supply routes, they will provide aid, they will, accompany the Congolese military in, perhaps rescue or facilitation missions, but they don't have the mandate to actually attack these groups. And that hasn't changed in all these years. And I think, we've seen now recently with all this unrest directed towards external entities because the population is angry. It's been all these years of, MONUSCO is meant to help and all these things, and it hasn't actually happened. And unfortunately, the Congolese military has, never developed the capabilities to effectively combat these armed groups. Obviously, local corruption plays a role in the ability of the state to counter these groups. So I think, unfortunately, all these years, there hasn't been a concrete attempt to fix it in a multi-pronged approach. And I think the state has now tried to do that with the Nairobi talks that were launched last year to offer the groups a line of dialogue to say, well, if you lay down your arms, this is the way forward. And I think that's probably the strongest move to date that the government has actually made. But from an offensive standpoint, the government and external actors have been very unsuccessful in being able to stabilize it. And that's fundamentally why the Pope didn't end up going to the North Kivu provincial capital of Goma, is because the insecurity deteriorated to such a degree because of the M23 conflict recently.
Thank you, Daniel. Now, Professor Olo, Daniel just painted a picture for us of the situation in the eastern DRC. And as we speak at this moment, not long after the Pope's plane left Kinshasa for Juba, fighting has resumed. More people are being displaced and the fighting is ongoing. Now, during his visit to the DRC, Pope Francis, who's known for his straight-talking manner, he also wears two hats. He's the head of state of the Vatican and the head of the Catholic Church, but he didn't mince any words when he pointed fingers at the West for what he said was a poisonous greed for wealth that was fueling conflicts in the country. So how does this statement, how do you think the West will take this diplomatically, and what impact would he have on the Congolese public at large who are waiting to see if the Pope can really make a difference?
Yeah, I think the Pope was very prophetic and very clear in identifying the cause of the problem, or the causes of the problem in the DRC and South Sudan. However, it is important to emphasize that the Pope is not a miracle worker that's going to solve the problem of the DRC. What the Pope came to do is to encourage the heart, to comfort those who are suffering, and to give hope to those who are making for peace, so that they keep on walking that path of peace without losing hope. However, it is true that not only Congo, South Sudan, Nigeria, you name it, Africa has always been a playing ground of many Western forces, and now also Chinese forces, as well as now Russia. But I always say this, that there is a Yoruba saying that if you do not plug the hole in your barn, then the rabbit that comes to eat your yam will keep coming. We know that Mobutu Sese Seko was a very brutal dictator. We know of Kabila that Dan just mentioned, and even his son that was literally forced out of power. The problem in the Congo cannot just be discussed without also we Africans taking responsibility. The African leaders. It's the same in South Sudan. Salva Kiir and Riek Machar have weaponized a rich ethnic mix between the Nuer and the Dinka that people who have coexisted together. So really, what we need in Congo as well as in South Sudan, we need a political solution, and it will involve the local leaders, the present government in Congo. You won't believe this, Gbenga, that when the Pope was speaking, so I work as the coordinator of the Pan-African Catholic Theology and Pastoral Network. So we worked with the Pope in November to have this gathering of over 3,000 African young people that had a conversation with Pope Francis virtually. And so the Pope, when he went to Kinshasa, wanted to meet them in person. And these youth that came, when the Pope was speaking, they were at a special part in that stadium. So when the Pope criticized the government, they rose and shouted some words I cannot repeat here against the state. Do you know that the next day, for 36 hours, the priest who led this group, an oblate priest, and 4 of the students were arrested and detained. We were looking for them, searching for them, using all avenues, until after 2 days they were found. That's the problem we have in some of these places, that you have brutal dictators, corrupt government officials, people who lack a vision, meaning the kind of vision that Patrice Lumumba had, that called the Congolese to unity as one people, a sense of African identity and a consciousness of the liberative power within African traditions that can set people free from the chain. And now, having broken that chains of colonialism, literally, like the Pope said, maybe it's only the thing that is on top of the ground. The things below the ground is still being manipulated and exploited by forces outside. But I must add, with cooperation with our own African leaders and governments in the Congo, people who are running the mines, people who are signing the deals, people who are building airstrips in the middle of huge forests in order to siphon away the wealth of the people. Who are the ones who are bringing in the arms or buying it? The rebels. The rebels, there are people who are benefiting from leading these rebels. So we must admit that what the Pope did is symbolic. The real work has just started for the people in the Congo and South Sudan.
Okay, thank you, Professor Oilo. Like you said, the Pope is not a miracle worker, and it can only appeal to the emotions and also help diplomatically to facilitate this peace talks to bring about lasting peace in the region. I'd like to bring in our third panelist on this program, Nixon Katembo, who joins us from Johannesburg in South Africa as a political affairs analyst. Hello, Nixon. Thanks for joining us on the program.
Thanks for having me.
We're happy to have you. Now, Nixon, in the open air mass in front of 1 million people, DRC's President Felix Tshisekedi did mention that Rwanda is a destabilizing factor in the Great Lakes geopolitics, and of course, specifically mentioned his support of M23 rebels who've been accused of committing human rights abuses and also destabilizing the region. Now, Rwanda has a strategic important role in the Great Lakes, and also around 40% of the country is Catholic. How and why did the Vatican not include Rwanda as part of the Pope's itinerary on this visit? Do you think it could have gone a long way in addressing the issues in the Great Lakes?
I think it's worth mentioning that the Catholic Cardinal of Rwanda was invited to the Pope's visit in Kinshasa, and a strong delegation came from Kigali to the Pope's visit. So to suggest that Rwanda was not included, I think that could be something different. But why Rwanda is not included? I think you would recall that during the AFDL rebellion, the invading forces supported by Rwanda killed they have killed about actually 3 bishops in Eastern Congo, both bishops from the Catholic Church, the Bishop of Bukavu, and then the one who replaced him, by the way. And eventually the third one, Bishop Emmanuel Kataliko, also was poisoned under difficult circumstances that they could not explain. And the Catholic Church was very categorical about that because this bishop was rushed to the Vatican in Rome, where he died and eventually came back to be buried in Bukavu. So there is a long history to that, and the long history to the power in Kigali blaming the Catholic Church at the time during genocide, that they conspired with what they call the genocide, and this is where somehow some of the refugees were found in a Catholic Church provenance. They're trying to take refuge there. So that has kind of put somehow Kigali at loggerhead with the Catholic Church, although those relations have been mended under the current Cardinal of Kigali.
Thank you, Nixon, for providing that context. Now, Daniel, let's look at South Sudan, the youngest country in the world. When South Sudan got its independence, a lot of people were happy that, the journey of this young country will be prosperous, and what the situation we have today, like Professor Oilo highlighted, is quite pitiable. Now, can you provide some insights on the political history of South Sudan and its journey to independence, including its present-day challenges, the challenges it has faced since gaining independence in 2011? What are the obstacles to peace in South Sudan?
So obviously there was a quite a violent exit from Sudan in a sense. And I think since then, there has just been, well, I think a big thing that Stan's been highlighting the entire time is the political will. And I think, unfortunately, from the get-go of South Sudan's independence, you just haven't had the ability of these factions that, which were effectively rebel groups, to come together and form a singular government. And it fundamentally stems from, the rivalry between Riek Machar and President Salva Kiir. And, obviously, we've had that war go on for years. And unfortunately, even though we've had now, this agreement since 2020, and this process of trying to facilitate, the peace agreement that was still, fundamentally signed in 2018, transitional government formed in 2020, but even now that you have this transitional government, these fractures still exist within the government themselves, and these rivalries still exist. So that underlying issue that has, effectively plagued the country from the get-go hasn't changed. And the problem now is it's a competition for resources in a sense of, which interests of, these former rebel groups, who is getting what. I know a big part of, the forming this government was the division of land, and each party would effectively get to control a certain region. And, obviously a lot of them were a little bit upset when they didn't get the oil regions and the likes of that. And unfortunately, now what we're seeing that as this has kind of gone on, the distrust, between each other has also gone within the parties themselves. And I think that's what we've seen now with the SPLMIO of Riek Machar, where we now have 4 factions of this group. And, they are now attacking the military. And you still have the rebel holdout groups who, peace talks have been suspended so many times, and they were only recently, renewed after the Pope's visit. So I think, unfortunately, there's mistrust all around. And, as Stan also mentioned, on a local level, it's the exploitation of these existing tribal tensions and grievances that, these different interests play against each other for their own benefit. And, on a local level, that hasn't changed. And at a top level, the political will hasn't been there to address it, since 2020. So unfortunately, you have all of these competing interests, and none of them have shown this will to work together. I don't want to say that it hasn't gotten better. I must say that if I had to, I've been monitoring South Sudan at least since about 2020, when, that government was formed. And since then, I can say that there has been, some effort on a local level to improve, but then you have these huge flare-up in conflicts that are primarily driven by local government actors tied to the rival interests at the top level of government. And unfortunately, to change that is going to be quite a process. And I think until the government actually puts the processes in place to actually effectively do those things, we're not going to see, that the stability towards the election that they're hoping for.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for providing that context. Now, Professor Ilo, like you mentioned earlier, look, South Sudan is not entirely a basket case. And Dan also highlighted that it's all about these individuals, the political will to come to the table and be honest and, just lay down the weapons or whatever interests that they have. Now, it's not the Pope's first interaction with South Sudan. In 2019 in the Vatican, the Pope famously kissed the feet of South Sudan's leaders during the meeting at the Vatican. My question to you is this: what impact did this gesture have on their efforts towards peace and reconciliation? And also the takeaway from the Pope's visit to South Sudan recently, the government announced that it was going to resume peace talks. What do you make of all of this?
Yeah, Gbenga, I must say that I'm really very skeptical if this is going to work. And I'm a person of faith. I'm a Catholic priest as well. So I teach people to hope. I believe there's a better day ahead. But I'm also a realist. When you look at South Sudan or the whole of the Sudan, of the Sudan, since 1955, they have gone through different phases of war. So the last 4 generations of South Sudanese, the only thing they have known wars, displacement, conflict, and so much suffering. South Sudan has 75% illiteracy rate. So maybe 1 out of 4 South Sudanese is the only have gotten some education, and the average age is 19 years. So you got a huge population that can move this country forward. I was in northern Uganda in August. I went to a place called Jumani. I spent time with South Sudanese. I met so many young people in their teenage years. They were born in Uganda. The only country they have known has been Uganda. So the whole place in Adjumani is over 500,000 people, refugees. The South Sudanese government contributes to feeding and supporting them, as well as other international donors. And US is a flourishing mini country. But this is not the future of South Sudan. So the Pope is also working with the bishop, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Anglican Church, and the Church of Scotland. There are people on the ground negotiating. There are people on the ground from other international agencies, like the Catholic agency called San Egidio, that help to bring about peace and resolve the conflict in Mozambique. They are trying. I mean, just as they are trying in Central African Republic after the Pope's visit there in 2015. Peacemaking in South Sudan is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. And that's why I said I am not going to rush into this optimism. Yeah, the Pope has come and then the problem is solved. They need to do a real healing. I mean, we need to get to the root bottom of the problem. 60 years of war, many people are wounded, just as Dan was talking about this idea that people have been sired in violence, mistrust, anger. So you have this revenge killing, reprisals.
It's a vicious cycle, yes.
Yeah, so you have this vicious cycle of violence. I mean, I was to go to Juba in August, but we couldn't because the day before, 4 people were killed on the same route where 2 sisters from the congregation that I was staying with had been murdered the previous year. So it requires a lot, much more than simply kissing the feet. I mean, it's a very symbolic gesture, but it has not worked. In my own thinking, I think it's time for President Salva Kiir and Riek Machar to step out of the scene. After 10 years of brutal war, desolation, and destruction of that country, maybe we need some fresh start. Let these 2 individuals get out of the way. They have not succeeded. Let some younger leaders come forward. That will be my resolution. We need to see new faces, not these 2 gladiators coming back again. After how many negotiations again? They make it, they break it. So I don't think this vicious cycle should continue.
Thank you, Professor Ilo. A fine place to go on a break. Like you said, the road to peace in South Sudan is not a sprint, but a marathon. We'll go on a quick break now, and when we return, we'll continue our conversation on the Pope's recent visit to South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo and its prospects for peace in the region. Do stay with us. This is Secure the Continent. If you just joined us, this is Secure the Continent. We've been discussing the Pope's recent visit to the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan and its prospects for peace in the region. I still have with me Nixon Katembo, analyst at Great Lakes in East Africa, who joins us live from Johannesburg, and Stan Chu Ilo, research professor of Catholic and African Studies at DePaul University, is joining us live from Illinois in Chicago. And also Daniel Van Dalen, senior analyst at Signal Risk, who joins us from Cape Town. Thanks for staying with us, gentlemen. Now I'd like to come to you, Nixon. We do recall the role of the church in in facilitating the end of Joseph Kabila's rule, the role of the bishops then. But critics have accused the Vatican of meddling in Congolese politics. Just how influential is the Catholic Church in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and what roles do they play in keeping about peace, in peacekeeping in the country?
The politics of the Congo, simply because the majority of the Congolese people are more, over than 70%, if I may say, are Catholics. And this is since the time of independence, where most of those who actually fought for independence, majority of them were Catholic adherent. And not only that, is that the Catholic Church continued to be part of the political process within the country. If you look at the 1990s National Sovereign Conference, which brought about the dialogue of political parties, oppositions, including Mobutu Sese Seko, the dictator at the time, agreeing to the demand of the opposition through the mediation of Laurent Mosengo Pasinya, then the Archbishop of Kinshasa. So the Catholic Church have a long history in the political history of the Congo, not only that, in shaping opinion and the leadership in that country. And for it to have come out with the negotiating the exit of Laurent Kabila and trying to, Joseph Kabila rather, trying to push him out of power and prevail upon him not to extend his rule, it was in the context of making sure that it entrenched democracy in the country, but also seeking an alternative leadership, but also ensuring peaceful transfer of power from one president to another, something which the Congo had not witnessed before. And even if you look at the current political process that is happening in the country, the leadership of the Catholic Church has been very vocal in trying to ensure that there is a transparent, democratic electoral processes going forward, and that the leaders do not rig those elections, and that the will of the people is heard. And then it has not been stopping there. You had the Archbishop of Kinshasa, Fridolin Ambongo, who went to this devastated region of the East, trying to speak to the people there and listen to them and how they faced the brunt of the war. And going back to Kinshasa, prevailing upon the leadership in Kinshasa to make sure that they take care of the populations there. So that is the overall, in its essence, of what the Catholic Church has been doing in the Congo, and still doing so in the current democratic juncture, as well as the peace process, as the country faces insecurity that it has endured for the past 30 years.
Thank you, Nixon, for highlighting the importance and, of course, the influence and the work that the Catholic Church does in the DRC, sometimes at a great risk to some of this individual clergymen. Men. Now, Daniel, when Stan Ilo opened the proceedings for this evening's discussions, he did mention the war in Ukraine, not to say that it's not important, but just to see the way the world perceives or looks at conflicts in Africa. I guess a lot of people just feel, this is a continent in a permanent state of war. And, when you hear there's a war here, sometimes we're desensitized from the impact of this war. We can't, we just say, okay, it's a war and then numbers. Now, can you describe the impact of the civil war in South Sudan on the country and its people? And what measures have been taken to address the humanitarian crisis and prevent further violence? And when these talks resume, as President Salva Kiir promised the Pope before he left Juba Do you have any hope that it will bring about lasting peace to the country?
So the civil war obviously is now technically at a close now with the establishment of the transitional government. And obviously the civil war was devastating for that country, obviously with child soldiers, crimes against humanity and all of those things. And that's why, restorative justice is a big part of what the transitional government actually still has to focus on. But just to jump to the peace talks aspect, so just to clarify, the peace talks that Salva Kiir is referring to is with basically the SSOA, which is a holdout rebel collective in a sense. So they did not initially join the transitional government when the peace agreement was signed in 2018. So they are what is called as the holdout groups. And so when we saw this transitional government established, these groups were still attacking, the military interests of President Salva Kiir and Riek Machar. And effectively, these peace talks are aimed at completely disarming these holdout rebel groups. But unfortunately, these talks have been kind of separate to the wider processes, even though they're still technically represented in government. So it's these peace talks specifically are one of the final things that the transitional government needs to kind of fulfill its promise. Obviously, there still needs to form a constitution. It still needs to form a special court and a lot of other things. But this is a big outstanding part of trying to create a single government, and you don't have these groups that are still outside of it. Obviously, there's still factionalism within the government, but obviously resuming these peace talks and finalizing and getting these holdout groups to disarm is a major thing.
Now, sorry to interrupt you. Dan, Professor Elo did suggest that, look, Riek Machar and Salva Kiir, they've been here and it's been a back and forth, one type of agreement or the other. He suggested that why don't the two parties step down and try other personnel? Do you think, how much of a hindrance to peace, to lasting peace, are these two individuals?
Absolutely. Fundamentally, it comes down to these two have been adversaries, and both of them led armies that committed absolute massacres against each other and the civilian population of the country. And fundamentally, they are in charge of groups that still hold that hostility to one another. So I think, yes, in a sense, you have these two leaders that unfortunately have been at the helm and effectively have done nothing from a political will perspective to really motivate it. You still see, these acts of hostility to get, against one another. And, there's obviously a part of it is an ego perspective of, former rivalries, we're now the president, the vice president, and that kind of political jockeying, unfortunately, between the two, I don't see stopping. Whether or not their removal will, remedy it, obviously, you still have that deep-seated mistrust between, these rival camps. But, as the professor said, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. So I think the first step, and I agree with him 100%, would be to remove them. But their immediate replacement, I don't think there are any immediate figures there that could quickly, assume the helm and, steer it to a different path, without, I think, a little bit of instability. Because effectively, you've had these two leaders spearheading this process, whether or not it's been successful or not all this time, their removal would open up to a bit of instability, because we've already seen infighting in Riek Machar's party calling for his removal, and suddenly we have 4 splinter factions. There have been rumors within Salva Kiir's camp as well that, there's army officers that are not happy with what's going on, that are not happy with the pace of the things that are going on. So there's definitely, discord within the ranks, and everybody wants these guys to either step down or, get it going. But like I said, just to repeat, I don't think, just removing them is going to fix it immediately. But I think removing them would be a positive step forward in getting there.
Thank you very much, Dan. Now, Professor Elo, as we begin to wind down on today's conversation, the Pope's Pilgrimage of Peace initiative, it's involved the leaders of the Catholic, Anglican Church and the Reformed Church of Scotland, and it differs from previous visits by religious leaders to conflict-affected regions. It's the first time, if I'm not mistaken, in the world when all of them would get together for such a mission. What inspired this, and what's your takeaway from this united front in preaching peace and the visit to the Congo and South Sudan?
Yeah, thank you, Gbenga. I think that it's like a good idea coming up between some good people who think alike. So the Archbishop Welby had been active in the Sudan. The Church of Scotland has also been active. The Catholic Church has been active through their agents working, trying to see how to bring about unity. Because, you know, when South Sudan got its independence in 2011, it was like eventually most of us Christians felt, okay, now that when South Sudan, moving away from Sudan, where the Christians were minorities and were treated as second-class citizens, that things can move forward because the majority of the people share common faith. So I remember meeting John Garang when I was in the high school, you know, when he visited Nigeria and visited our own part of the world. And, you know, he was such a giant. And I think the problem of South Sudan is really caused by the death of John Garang in this mysterious helicopter crash. So he was a sign of unity. So I think that having a symbol or symbols of unity in this way is also a way of modeling for the people that it is possible for people to come together. Now, so that is one, the symbolism of these three. And then, you know, many people don't know this, that the Catholic Church, at least the one I know, because I've been involved in South Sudan myself. We have projects in South Sudan working with Bishop Eduardo Hiboro in Tambala, Yambio. Then we know about the retired Bishop of Torit, Bishop Paride Taban. He established a peace village in a place called Puran in Torit. In the area he moved away from Torit. In this big desert, he built a village. He called it a peace village. You have Arabs, you have Muslims, blacks, whites, and even people from Ethiopia and Uganda in this village. So this bishop says, let me demonstrate.
In South Sudan, this village is located in South Sudan.
Yes, okay. The peace village in South Sudan, established by Bishop Paride Taban. He said, so let's have a model. It's possible for people to live together. I think it is what Bishop Paride did in Quran, that the three church leaders showed to people in South Sudan and elsewhere. In spite of the divisions among these churches, now they can unite. And I think that's what religion should do. Religion should bring people together. And so, since South Sudanese, including Rick Machar and the Salva-Kiir and the rest in their team, since all these people profess their faith in Jesus Christ and they are Christians, maybe they can find in the message of the gospel that says how blessed are the feet of those who bring the message of peace. Maybe they can find the inspiration, because sometimes here, you know, the spiritual momentum can actually compel the conscience to think differently about things. And I think that's in that sense that I find this symbolic gesture a very forceful way of encouraging people to try the same, to unite, so that God's people can enjoy abundant life and flourish as human beings and Africans in their own land.
And on that positive and optimistic note, I would like to say a very big thank you to the panelists, Nixon Katembo, Analyst, Great Lakes and East Africa, who joined in from Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you very much. Stan Chu Ilo. Research Professor of Catholic and African Studies at DePaul University, joining from Chicago, Illinois, and also Daniel Van Dalen, Senior Analyst at Signal Risk, joining from Cape Town. I do appreciate your time, your insights, and your contribution to the program this evening. Thank you.